Hello everybody, this is a lecture of Ancient Indian Survey, and today we are going to talk about Buddhism. In the last lecture we talked about the rise of Jainism and various doctrines of Jainism and how they were a result of the socio-economic conditions of the time and how they impacted the socio-economic conditions of the time. And today we are going to look at the second major philosophical trend that survived for a long period of time, that emerged in the as a reaction to the later Vedic social setup, socio-economic setup, that is Buddhism. To look at Buddhism, we need to know who was the founder of Buddhism. It was Gautama Buddha. We will look briefly at the life, various events of the life of Gautama Buddha. Following that, we are going to look at certain important doctrines of Buddhism and how and why it spread far and wide. What were the basic reasons behind that widespread acceptance and widespread popularity of Buddhism as such. So, when we talk about Gautama Buddha, we need to understand that Gautama Buddha again belonged to the belonged to the caste of the Kshatriyas. This is the the second caste in the caste hierarchy, or second varna in the caste hierarchy of Vedic times. And we know by the later Vedic period there was a rigidity in the caste order, and the Kshatriyas and the Vaishyas were majorly upset with the established social setup of the varnas, castes and jatis. And as a result of that, as a reaction to that unhappiness, there were certain new religious or philosophical trends that were emerging, and it was through funding and through support from these displeased two varnas of Kshatriyas and Vaishyas that these new religious trends were gaining popularity and were gaining support. And it was a result of their support that these philosophical ideals could grow, flourish and be accepted as religions with wide following, especially in the case of Buddhism, because Buddhism was much more famous, much more widely accepted, much more popular than the Jain tradition, right? With Buddhism, we know that Buddha, Gautama Buddha, is known as the enlightened one. The Buddha means the enlightened one, and he himself belonged to the Shakya clan, and his father was a Kshatriya Raja of the Shakya Gana Sangha. We have come across Gana Sangha when we talked about the socio-political and economic setup of the 16 Mahajanapadas, when we talked about the rise of the socio-economic background of the rise of Buddhism and Jainism. So we know what a Gana Sangha is, and it was to one of these Gana Sanghas, the Shakya Gana Sangha, that the father of Gautama Buddha belonged to. And he was it is accepted, widely accepted by scholars and historians, that Gautama Buddha was born in 6th century BC. Some of the traditions place his date of birth around 567 BC, and he lived, obviously because he was the son of a Kshatriya and he was the son of a ruling figure, so that is why he lived his life as an aristocrat for a long period of time. But eventually, over a period of time, he got dissatisfied with the life that he was living, dissatisfied with the things around him. He was observing and being disturbed by the various problems that he was seeing in lives of various other people around him. He came into contact with sick people, with suffering people, with people who have seen death, and he was in a meditative or in a reflective, he had that reflective bent of mind from the very beginning, and it was a result of all these observations and a result of the reflection that eventually at the age of 29 he left his aristocratic family and he went away, roamed as an ascetic, went about places, gained experience, and eventually at the age of 35 he attained what is termed as enlightenment or nirvana in Bodh Gaya under a peepal tree, and that is why peepal tree is a symbol associated with Gautama Buddha. We know that for a long time Buddha was not represented as a human figure, and it was various symbols that represented Buddha, and people tree is a very important symbol that represents Buddha. So this was his very brief idea about what his life was. After attaining enlightenment, he went from place to place, made his sermons, preached his message, and at the age of 80 in 487 BC, he died at Kushinagar. So this is an outline of Buddha's life. We're now going to look at what were the Buddhist doctrines, what was this enlightenment, or what was this knowledge that Buddha had gained following his wanderings as an ascetic, and how he preached it to people, and how he expected the followers of his ideology to behave. Right? Let's not call it a religion yet, because we know that in the beginning Buddhism and Jainism both were philosophical ideological trends. Eventually they became religious religions in proper sense of the term. So Gautama Buddha, what was he basically trying to do? He was trying to not do what the Brahmins and what the Vedic social setup was doing. Sorry, he was trying to inculcate or indulge not in the metaphysical and higher discussions and debates about soul and reality of soul and Brahma, the creator and the soul, the Atma, and he did not want to indulge in those debates or those arguments. Instead, he wanted to focus on the realities of life, on the hardships that people are facing in the real life, people who are suffering from sorrows, people who are suffering from pain, and he wanted to focus on that instead of merely indulging in the philosophical debates of Atma and Brahma and soul. And that is why he was so popular among people, because he talked in their language, he talked in the terms that the common man, the common people understood, which was not the case with the Brahmins or the Vedic Vedic religious setup in that sense. What was his ideas now? Because he was looking at the human emotions or the human sorrows or immediate human problems, he knew that the basic core of any problem, of any human pain, of any human sorrow is human desire. Now again we will see that there is a parallel between Buddhism and Jainism, because when we talked about Jainism there as well, we realized that Mahavira Jaina also talks about how to conquer desire is to conquer desire is the highest victory that a human being can have. And on a similar note, here Buddha is talking about how desire is the root of all sorrow, all pain. So this is the idea with which he is going to people, and he is talking about how if desires are conquered, if desires are controlled by human beings, then nirvana, that is enlightenment or peace, can be achieved by them. And when that happens, the man becomes free from the cycle of birth and death. So now there is a consciousness about the Avagaman narrative of later Vedic society, of the Vedic thought, of Brahmanical thought, where it is assumed or where it is asserted that a person is born in a particular condition because of the actions that they did in the past, and it is a constant cycle of birth and rebirth that is going on throughout various phases, and only the higher varnas can attain freedom from this cycle of birth and rebirth. But here Buddha is saying he is still believing in the idea of birth and rebirth, but he is arguing that people can be freed from this cycle of birth and rebirth if they conquer their desires and if they attain nirvana by conquering their desires. So having talked about this idea of what is desire and why is it important for human beings to conquer desire, let's just talk about what were the basic teachings apart from this particular basic notion in Buddhism. the basic notion is that the desire is the cause of all sorrow, and to conquer sorrow you need to conquer desire, and when you conquer desire you attain nirvana, and when you attain nirvana you become free from the cycle of birth and rebirth, right? What Buddha did, Buddha in his first discourse, which was delivered at Sarnath, he talked about the turning of the wheel of law, and he incorporated in his first sermon, he talked about 4 noble truths. What were these 4 noble truths? These 4 noble truths are that the world is full of suffering. Suffering is caused by human desires. The renunciation of the desires is the path to nirvana, and nirvana is equal to the freedom from the cycle of birth and rebirth. And this particular nirvana is achieved through an 8-fold path. So this the basic notion that I was talking about in the very beginning, this was embedded in Buddha's first sermon, where he talked about 4 truths of the world, or 4 noble truths. I'll go over them again. That the world is full of suffering. Suffering is caused by human desires. Renunciation of desire, or control or victory over desire, would cause nirvana, that is the freedom from the cycle of birth and rebirth. And this particular control over desire or freedom from desire can be achieved through an 8-fold path. And now what is this 8-fold path? This 8-fold path contains certain elements. What are these elements? Just I'll go through the various elements of the 8-fold path. The elements are: one should have right views, one should have right resolve, one should have right speech, right conduct, right livelihood, right efforts, right recollection, and should meditate. So there should be an aspect of meditation as well. And when all these things are combined, all these 8 elements are combined, this is something that is called by Buddha as the middle way, as the way which would lead to conquering of desires and which would lead to attainment of nirvana by any human being, right? So this is this reflects how easy and how basic Buddha's teachings were, and this simplicity was a cause of success or cause of popularity of Buddhism in that sense. Now to understand these elements, nobody needs to have these extravagant information or these detailed information about various texts or various religious treatises. They just need to understand these basic 4 noble truths, and they need to understand the 8-fold path, and very simple elements are there in the 8-fold path. So this was the doctrine of Buddhism, the entire narrative into which Buddha initiated his people, his disciples, his followers. And now having looked at the various doctrines and various elements of Buddhist thought, we are just going to look at the manner in which it challenged the realities of that particular time period when it emerged. So the time period when Buddhism emerged is again the later Vedic period. We know that Buddha came in 6th century BC, and it was during this time that we know that there is various changes and various rigidities are setting in the Vedic society, and a reaction to that is this particular emergence of various religious philosophical trends. How did it challenge the established order? It challenged the established order by directly questioning the authority of the Vedas, and Buddhists asserted that revealed texts and deities are not needed in Buddhism. There is need of no deity, no idol, no human figure or physical form of God to follow Buddhism, and there is no revealed texts as such in the Buddhist thought. So this is something that was something very different from the established religious order, and they believed in the presence of a universal law. Again, there is a similarity with the Jain idea of a natural law being in place and making things happen. So because of this idea of natural law, or of an essential law that is running the universe, it is assumed or it is asserted that Buddhist thought was of an atheistic nature, because it argued for natural cosmic rise and decline. They did not attribute the rise and decline of life and of civilizations to God, but they believed that there was a natural law that was in place which was causing the rise and decline of various things and various lives and various civilizations in that sense. And this was something that was very different from the established order. They not only questioned the authority of the Vedas, and they did not only said that there is no need for a deity to in Buddhism, but they also said that Brahmanical rituals were not important, were not required to attain spiritual heights. They believed that sacrificial rituals in which animals were sacrificed were highly problematic. They asserted that they would simply collect around a sacred collect inside a sacred space or around a funeral tumuli. We know that funeral tumulus is something that was the core or the root of the stupas, which were eventually associated with Buddhist religious thought. And usually these Buddhists used to gather in small enclosures or simple sanctuaries, and they used to just gather and perform their spiritual practices, or they used to gather and worship around a funerary tumuli, that is a space where somebody is buried or somebody's belongings are buried, and there is a mound on that particular funerary space. So this was a direct challenge to the established Vedic Brahmanical setup. Not only that, but what Buddhism was doing, or what Buddhist thought was doing, was it was directly challenging the Vedas, it was directly challenging the teachings of the Upanishads, right? And a very important challenge that it was making was to the established social system or established social setup of the caste system. It, to be very clear, it did not outrightly called for the elimination of caste, because caste was a reality of that particular period of time, and it was the established social setup. There was, if they would want to destroy caste altogether, that would be a very radical rearrangement or radical change in the society, which was not possible when caste was that real social element in that particular setup. So what they did was, they argued that caste should not be related to the religious spiritual attainment. Caste can be there as a social element. Caste and varna or jati can be there as to assert the social status of an individual and to regulate the marriages and the marriage rituals, because that was important. When we talked about caste system, we talked about how occupation and marriages were the original elements that were there in the caste order. And what Buddhism argued was that let the caste be associated with occupation and marriage and the social status, but the religious liberation and religious attainment should not be linked to the castes, and anybody belonging to any particular caste or any particular varna can attain enlightenment if they follow the Eightfold Path laid down by Buddha. So this was something that was highly problematic in a Brahmanical Vedic setup, because they did not want, they asserted that the lower varnas or the lower castes or the outcasts cannot attain nirvana, they cannot attain spiritual heights or spiritual liberation, because they belong to a particular varna or a particular caste. So this is an important change that was brought in by Buddhist thought in the ordering of, or in the caste system or the caste order. We need to remember that the Buddhism or the Buddhist thought did not outrightly removed or changed the caste order. The caste was still there, it was accepted as a social marker, but as religious marker it was stopped, it was not acknowledged by Buddhists. This was something very radically different from the earlier religious setups. And what further happened was, another very important element was the inclusion of women in the Buddhist fold. So we know that even though in the earlier Vedic society women were not allowed to read the Vedas, or women even when they belonged to the higher castes were not allowed to access the Vedas or the higher religious texts. And in Buddhism there were certain certain inhibitions on part of Buddha as well, but eventually women were made a part of the Buddhist setup, and they were allowed to become nuns in the Buddhist order. Eventually women became an important part of Buddhism, and this inclusion of women in the Buddhist fold also was a very radical change, or a very important change on the social front. So this was something that was very important, inclusion of lower castes who can attain nirvana if they follow the Eightfold Path, and inclusion of women in the Buddhist fold. Further, we also know that there was a setup of establishment of Buddhist monasteries. These monasteries were the places where education was provided to these new entrants into the faith or into the ideological bent of mind, and in those monasteries there was no restriction to the upper caste, and education was not limited to the upper castes or the upper varnas, and lower caste people can also be inducted in the monasteries, and they can also gain education, and that was something again a very revolutionary step in the social system of that particular time. This is majorly how Buddhist thought or Buddhist ideology challenged the social setup, socio-religious setup of the time when they are when it is functioning. Apart from that, we just need to revise, because we've already talked about it. We need to revise about what are the basic texts of Buddhism. We know that the Buddhist canon is termed or is enclosed in this particular text known as three Pitikas. It's a collection of 3 texts. The 3 Pitikas include Vinaya Pitaka, which includes the rules and regulations of Buddhism; Sutta Pitaka, which includes the lectures delivered by Buddha; and Abhidhamma Pitaka, which is a work on philosophy and psychology of Buddhist thought. But we know that these texts were not written down in the time of Buddha. They were transmitted orally, they were recited, and they were collected only after Buddha's death, and written down many centuries later after Buddha's death. So this is what we need to know, what we need to understand about Buddhism. Buddhism is defined by this canon known as 3 Pitaka, and these 3 Pitakas I have I have told you in detail what they include, but we need to remember, like all the other religious and philosophical trends, these texts were written down much later after the death of Gautama Buddha, the founder of the ideological trend, that is Buddhism, which eventually developed to become a religion on its own. Having asserted various details, having looked at the doctrines of Buddhism, looked at how it challenged the social order of the time, we will just briefly look at what were the reasons of the widespread popularity of Buddhism, and how and why it spread so widely, right? We know, I have already told you people about how Buddhist thought did not indulge in philosophical debates about the creation of life, about the presence or absence of soul, but they asserted or they talked about the real issues of the time, the sorrows and the desires, and that is why they were they appealed to the common man, they appealed to the common masses. Further, it was the lower orders, because they were allowed education, because they were allowed religious freedom, because they were allowed the scope to attain nirvana through this particular trend of religious thought. That is why the lower castes and the lower orders and the lower varnas actively became involved in the Buddhist thought, and they became active disciples of the Buddhist thought. Further, the use of language, the Pali and the Prakrit were used to disseminate the Buddhist doctrines, and these were the languages which were very popular. These were the popular languages, these were the common man's language, and because of that it was Buddhist doctrine spread easily. We need to understand, we need to contrast it with the Vedic knowledge, which was only limited to Sanskrit, and Sanskrit was a language that was limited to the upper caste, especially to the Brahmins, and that is why it was not accessible to the common man, to the lower varnas. In contrast to that, the Buddhist doctrines were preached in Prakrit and Pali, which were the common man's languages, and that is something that contributes to the popularity of Buddhist thought. Further, there was also a system of organization of Sanghas. Sanghas are basically religious setups in which people come and people are inducted, and they have these religious teachings are provided to them. And interestingly, in these Sanghas, even though Buddhism is supposed to be a very inclusive order, slaves and soldiers and debtors, people who are under debt, were not allowed in these Sanghas. It's a very interesting exclusion from the Sanghas. The lower castes were allowed. We know that these in these schools or in these monasteries, in these Sanghas, lower castes were allowed to come. They were given proper teaching in the religious doctrine of Buddhism. Again, we know that eventually there were three things that came to be associated with Buddhism: Dhamma, Sangha and Buddha. The Dhamma are basically the teachings of Buddha, and Sangha, as we know, that they are the monasteries or the places of gathering of disciples who attach themselves to the Buddhist faith, and Buddha, obviously the founder of this particular doctrine. And eventually the Ashoka's conversion of the modern emperor Ashok to Buddhism, and his active attempts in spreading this ideological religious thought to various sections of the world, contributed majorly in making Buddhism a world religion, or a religion which was spread across the world, especially in the regions of Central Asia, West Asia and Sri Lanka, because these are the places where Ashoka sent his missions, Buddhist missions, to spread this Buddhist religious thought. So this is all we need to know about Buddhism. We need to understand that Buddha and Buddhism was a reaction to the social economic setup of the time. There were certain important things to it. There were 4 noble truths, there were 8-fold path, and there were 3 important things associated with Buddhism. 4 noble truths being that the world is full of sorrow, sorrow is caused by desires, desires need to be controlled, and only through following an 8-fold path can those desires be controlled. The 8-fold path included various elements, including right speech, right path, right livelihood, etc., etc. And the 3 elements which eventually became associated with the Buddhist religion are the Buddha, Dhamma and Sangha, and we know what these 3 things are, and we know this is the outline of Buddhism. And we also need to understand and remember that Buddhism was how Buddhism was challenging the social setup of the time by including lower castes, by including women in its fold. Thank you.